Hello everyone, it is Caitlin, and today I'm going to teach you how to face a mid-19th century skirt. A facing is a piece of cotton fabric, usually around 6 to 10 inches wide on average. Now I've seen facings that were close to 4 inches, and I've seen them go all the way to the knee and beyond. So the 6 to 10 is definitely an average, but that's what you'll usually see. Facings are not in 100% of original garments. Occasionally you'll see a turned hem in a mid-19th century garment, although generally those are for children's dresses and on sheer dresses. A lot of silk skirts in this time period are also lined, and therefore you don't necessarily need a facing if it is lined. However, a facing is a very simple thing to do, and it has a lot of benefits. Think about when you're walking with a very long, full skirt. Your boots are going to be kicking up dirt, they're going to be kicking against the edge of your skirt. That is not only going to be causing your skirt to get dirty, it's also going to cause a wear over time with your boots or shoes constantly hitting that edge. In a slightly trained skirt, think like later 1860s, the bottom of your skirt is going to be on the ground, and this is just going to protect the edge of your fashion fabric so that your silk or your wool or your nice cotton isn't going to get dirty. Simply put, a facing is just a little scrap piece of fabric that is put on the edge of skirts to prevent wear and dirt. In lighter fabrics such as sheers or silks, the facing will actually weigh down your hem, that way you don't get bunching up at your waist. My first silk taffeta dress I ever made, I didn't know about facings yet, and so I just did a simple turned hem on that gown, and the first time I wore that, I only wore it for about 2 hours. But shortly after putting it on, I realized after just walking around, that skirt was riding up on my hoops, and I had a whole bunch of fabric just pulled over here, and you could see all of my petticoats. I did a little bit of research, found out about facings, and needless to say, all of my silk skirts now have facings. And I've never had the issue of my skirts riding up at my waist ever again. On sheer dressings, a facing provides the transition so that you don't see where your skirt ends and your petticoat begins. And lastly, a facing will finish the edge of your skirt. It also has the added benefit of only using a 1/2 inch of fashion fabric, as opposed to a turned hem, which will often use 2 inches or more. When you're working with expensive silks and wools, not having a turned hem but using a facing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance can help you recoup up to a 1/2 yard of fabric, which is a great savings over time. Now that we've talked about facings and why we use them, let's talk a little bit about the fabrics we use for facings. The number one most bog common type of facing you'll see in original garments is polished cotton, which is just a cotton fabric that has a little polish or shine over top of it, which is also going to help repel dirt and keep the facing clean. Now, polished cotton is really hard to find, especially in 100% cotton, but I do know that Needle and Thread in Gettysburg does sell it. You have to call them to place an order, but you can get polished cotton from them, and they have a few colors other than brown. Polished cotton has the added benefit of being not only the most common, but it's also can be used across the board. Whether you're working with a cotton dress, or a silk dress, or a wool dress, or a ball gown, or whatever you're doing, you will see polished cottons across all fibers. Please always do look at originals when you're deciding what facing to use. In general, lower quality dresses, such as working cottons, wools, homespun, that sort of thing, you can also use scraps of other cotton dresses. So if you had a dress that was really worn, you can take that apart and use part of it as a facing. In a book I own, there's a picture of an original 1840s wrapper that actually has 4 different scrap fabrics in its facing. And so this is really a place where you can recoup those older dresses that maybe have holes. They're just not enough to use for anything else, but you can use them as a facing. So if you have any period appropriate cotton scraps lying around and you're doing a working type lower class dress, you can use that extra fabric as a facing. In higher end silks, you'll occasionally see things like batiste or organdy used as facing, but again, polished cotton is the most common type of facing that you will see. Another option you can do if you're working with wools or cottons is you can use a plain woven brown cotton as well. That's occasionally seen as well. So with all that being said, let's put in some facings. I have 3 dresses today that need some facings, and we're going to do the facing slightly differently each way so you can see some of the variety that we see in originals. As always, the best thing to do is to start with originals. So look for images online if you don't know anyone with a personal collection. This particular gown is from my personal collection. It is a black silk dress dating to the 1850s. I'll post a link to the video where I studied this dress in detail above, so you can kind of go check that out if you're interested. Now this dress is quite ratty, but I do like those because you can see the construction of the gowns more closely. This dress is remade by someone who was much shorter and a little stouter than the original wearer, and the remaker was a very lazy seamstress. My favorite type of Victorian seamstresses are the lazy ones. It makes me feel so great. So instead of actually cutting this skirt down, so like here's her hem. So the original hem has a facing and hem braid. Instead of actually, taking the hem braid off and then taking the facing off, shortening the skirt and then sewing the facing back on, she was just like, screw that. We're just going to fold it up however I need and just tack it down. And that is exactly what she did, and it is awesome. It cracks me up every time I look at it. The hem is in such poor condition because she did that, but it still cracks me up because that is like the laziest thing to do ever. Because this hem is now not very protected, so clearly she wasn't planning on wearing this for very long, because this is what happens when you don't do anything to the hem of your dresses. It just kind of rats out. But you can see her cotton facing. This is the part that has fallen out. So you can see her cotton facing here. And she chose brown polished cotton for her facing here. And it is about 4¼ inches wide. So she probably cut it almost 5 inches, which is really short for a facing. Usually you see them much wider. This is definitely on the shorter side. She has these lovely little Van Dyke edges, kind of like pinking shears, but a whole lot bigger. And I'm going to show you how to replicate those in a moment. And then, of course, she has hem braid finishing the edge for an extra layer of protection while we're making this. So this is actually going to be the edge we're going to do on our first facing. We're going to do 3 facings today, and they're each going to be slightly different, so you can see some variety in how facings were put together. And we have already talked about why we add hem facings, but I wanted to show you why we add hem facings. So this is a silk dress, one of my favorite silk dresses. And first off, I did not put this facing in correctly because it should not be white. They were almost always brown or a dark color. Sometimes you'll see like green or something like that. But almost never white, particularly on silk dresses. Now you'll see white ones on sheer dresses like we discussed before, but this is not sheer. It really should not have been white. And you see why we don't add white hem facings, because they get really gross and dirty. If I had a brown hem facing on this, you wouldn't be able to see the nastiness. But yeah, you can see that this is definitely taking the edge, whereas if I did not face it, this would have been on the actual silk. But over here we have a nice little, we're going to assume it's a mud spot on my facing, but nothing on the actual silk skirt. So that facing actually protected my expensive silk from getting dirt on it. Yes, this is why we put facings in. So without further ado, let's go ahead and face some skirts. Here is our dress fabric and our facing that I have ironed. And we're going to pin this right sides together. So this is my seam, there's the right side, and here's the right side of my fabric. I'm going to pin those all the way around. It doesn't matter where you start in your skirt because this is all going to be on the inside, so it doesn't matter if it's in the front and it's in the back. If it starts on the seam, no one cares. I've now reached the end, and I have just a little bit of overlap, so what I'm going to do is measure exactly how much overlap I have, and I'm going to seam this by the machine. I'm just going to make sure they match up first. You can cut them down so that you actually have the usual seam allowance, but I don't usually do that. I kind of just sew it like this, and then if I want to, I can cut it down. Mark where you need the seam allowance to go. I'm going to stitch this down very quickly, so we'll have a complete circle the exact size of our dress. Now that I have my perfectly matching circle, I can finish putting a pin in, and we're going to stitch this all the way around at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now that it's sewn together, we're going to iron our facing out. I don't seem to notice a difference whether you iron the seam allowance this way or this way. Just do whatever seems easiest to you. Just iron it all the way around. Now that it isn't completely ironed out, we're going to finish this edge. Now you can just leave it raw like this since we ripped it. It won't be raveling on you, which I've seen on originals and I do with most of my dresses. We're going to do that with a dress down the line in just a little bit. But I also have these vintage pinking shears, which make a Van Dyke corner that is much larger than modern pinking shears. So about twice, these are about twice the size as modern pinking shear little pinks. So if you happen to invest in one of these vintage ones, I do want to let you know that you need to pull it very tight as you're cutting. Otherwise, you're going to get a little triangle that looks very much like a pinky shear triangle, and you're going to wonder why you couldn't just use regular pinky shears to begin with. But when you pull it tight, you get the larger ones. But yes, there is definitely a learning curve with these, which is why I generally just leave them with the ripped edge anyway, or turn them under. There are other ways to finish this edge. You don't have to use the vintage pinking shears, but if you happen to have a set, or if you wanted this look, say you're recreating original and you need this type of edge, go ahead and invest in one. Just know that it's not always the easiest thing to mess with. So now that we have finished our edge here, we're going to flip it up and iron it down this way. You want just the tiniest bit of the fashion fabric peeking up at you. Just a hint of it. You're going to iron that down. And I like to pin this edge. It makes it easier on me as I'm sewing. And you're going to do that all the way around. Just pinning the facing up, and then we get to stitch it down. Alright, we have here the edge of the facing all pinned up, so there's my right end of the fabric. Again, you can see my large little Van Dyke edge here. So the next step is to sew the facing to the skirt. This is best done by hand. All originals I have seen have been done by hand, and this makes sense when you think about it. First of all, you can make a hand stitch practically invisible so you don't see the stitching line. You can't do that by machine. Secondly, if the facing were to accidentally rip, like if you were to step on it or got snagged on a branch or something, hand stitches will break and pull away more easily. Machine stitching, especially stitching as small as a period stitching, wears like iron, and it's more likely that your fashion fabric will rip before the stitching does, which just means you'll have a giant gaping hole in the middle of your skirt. So personally, I like to take a few extra minutes to stitch the facing by hand and preserve my expensive fashion fabric in case this would happen. It doesn't matter if you're a good seamstress, the Victorians don't seem to have taken any care to do nice, neat little small stitches when it comes to attaching a facing. Remember, facings are meant to be replaceable if dirtied. No sense in putting a lot of effort into something that's just going to be replaced. When sewing by hand, I suggest taking larger jumps on the inside of the skirt and tiny little bites of the fashion fabric. It adds to the invisibility. Tiny little bite, little bit of a jump. Tiny little bite. And you're just basically doing it running stitch. So it's big bite, tiny bite. You just take the pins out as you get to them. Little bite, big bite. So I've done a couple of inches of stitching here. So when I turn it right side out, you can't see my stitching whatsoever. So my stitching line is right here. And when you really look closely, you can see, but really you can't. And that is partially because it's a really busy print. That certainly helps. If you have a solid fabric, you're going to see the stitching, and it's fine. They didn't particularly care either. You can even look at originals so you can see where their facing is attached. It's not a big deal. It does not matter at all if your stitches kind of are a little sloppy. Again, it's meant to be replaceable. And I'm maybe about 3/8 of an inch from the edge, but it doesn't particularly matter. You don't want to go like further down to where this is going to flip down, but you want to give it enough space. on the top. So if this does ravel a little bit, your stitching's not going to come undone. Although I've never had that happen. And here's our finished skirt. Now you can just leave it like this, or we can add hem braid to further protect the edge. However, with this particular dress, I am not going to do that. I'm just going to leave it as is, which is also perfectly correct. But if you expect to do a whole lot of, walking outside, hard labor, anything that's going to really wear on this edge, you're going to do a whole lot of walking, I would add hem braid to that. I didn't necessarily do the greatest of job with that pinking. Some of them look a little off, but it definitely takes a little bit of a learning curve. So just know there are other ways to finish our edge, and one of those is just by ripping it and leaving it raw, which is what we're going to do with our next silk skirt. So here's a silk dress I'm remaking. It's a gold shot black silk taffeta that's embroidered. It looks green, but it's really just your eyes playing tricks on you. It really is just a gold shot with black. And we're going to face this with batiste, which is an option for nicer silk dresses. So again, we're going to rip our panels. I think I'm going to rip these around 5.5 inches wide. So now that these panels are ripped, we're going to sew them together just as before, but we're not going to sew the ends in the circle yet. Now that we have a really long rectangle, we're going to pin this right sides together all the way around the skirt. Now this one's facing is grayish. It's like a greenish, bluish gray actually, which you do see color facings occasionally. It is vastly more common to have brown facings. However, I thought I had brown polished cotton to do this one in, and I did not, but I had enough batiste, and you do see that occasionally. So I am doing batiste on here. And now that I'm reaching the end, what I'm going to do is overlap them slightly, about a seam allowance width. Like that. And now I can put these two together and stitch this up, which gives me an exact circle the size of the skirt. And with that stitched together, our exact circle, we can go stitch all the way around the skirt like we did before. So same thing as before, we're going to iron all this flat. I'm also going to make sure to iron this top part flat as well. Because this is a silk dress that won't get washed, and because facings were meant to be removable, you'll see ones that aren't finished at all. In fact, nearly all of my reproduction dresses feature non-finished ripped facing, and I've never had an issue with raveling. Just make sure that your fabric is ripped and not cut, and that your fabric isn't unusually ravel prone, and you shouldn't have an issue on dresses that you won't wash or won't wash often. And so just like before, we're just ironing it right to where you can just barely see the fashion fabric peek up at you. And we're going to sew this together exactly the way we did the last one, which is just larger bites on the back and tiny little bites on the front. And here's the skirt finished. This one I will not put hem braid on simply because I rarely wear this dress, and when I do, it's never outside or anywhere it's going to take a beating. If that ever changes, I can always come back and add it, but for this particular dress, as of right now, I don't feel it's necessary. And because we ripped that edge directly on the grain, we will not have a raveling problem, which is what you want. You don't want the raveling problem. The last skirt we're going to face is a working cotton dress, so we're going to salvage around in my scrap bucket for some scraps for this facing. Alright, so here are some scraps I managed to find. This one's a nice teal plaid that is left over from a wrapper I think I still have somewhere, maybe. And then of course these are from the paisley cotton we worked on before. And this is some scraps from my 1830s cotton dress. One cool thing about using scraps like this to do your facings is that it really does pull in spectators if you're doing like living history or reenacting, and you can give them a lot of information just discussing like your clothing. You know, if you pulled up your hem and are showing them like your underpinnings and they see all the different types of fabrics in your facings, you can kind of pull them into that and say, oh, well, this is a scrap from my mother's dress from 20 years ago. Adding that kind of thing to your story can add humanity to your impression, and it tells the spectator a lot about how people viewed fabric and clothing back then. So this teal fabric was already cut into strips for a facing, and so I just cut the other ones the same width. They're about 7 inches wide for this particular facing. And we're going to basically kind of do the same thing as before. So I'm actually going to fold this edge over just slightly, and I'm going to pin it all the way around like we've done the others. And just as a total side note, as I'm doing this, I'm realizing that all these fabrics are blue, which isn't necessary. I think it tells you more about me and my favorite color than anything else. So these are just the scraps that I had because I tend to wear a lot of blue. I tend to buy blue fabrics. But I just thought I should mention that the fact that they are blue was not purposeful. It was an accident. You can use whatever color you would like. And then when we get to the end, what we're going to do is just kind of overlap with that fold over that we did, and then cut that off, allowing for some overlap. And so what I will do now is I'm going to take a needle and I'm going to just do a running stitch very quickly, just up there. It doesn't have to be a really nice running stitch, but you know, a running stitch all the way up. Make sure you're catching the fold over, but not your dress fabric. You don't want to cut. You don't want to sew the dress fabric. And now we have a exact facing edge that we can stitch down. But that's a really easy way to do facings without measuring anything. So we're going to iron this just like before, but since this is a dress that will be heavily laundered, I don't want to leave these edges raw. So I'm actually going to turn them down and iron them. And you can do it now like I'm doing, or you can wait till you fold the whole thing over and iron it down as you sew. Whichever way is easiest for you. And you don't have to worry about measuring. When you're turning that over, just eyeball it. It's a facing. No one's going to see it unless you show them, of course. And it's removable anyway, so it's not meant to last forever. Making the fashion fabric just kind of peek up at us slightly. And just as before, we're going to do our giant honkin' toddler stitches. Again, taking a bigger bite out of the inside than the outside so that we don't see it. Although honestly, with a plaid like this, you're likely not to see the stitches anyway. But it's not a terrible thing if you see them. Like, there are some photographs where you can clearly see where the line is of stitching, so, or at least you know where the weight is pulling down on the skirt. You can see where the facing ends. So it's a period problem to have if you can see. Once we get this done, we are done with this facing. Let's see how visible it is. Oh yeah, it blends right in, so it's right on this little white line, which I don't think I could have planned that better. So it is invisible, which is awesome. And here's the finished skirt edge. You can see all the pieces that went into it. I finished this edge with hem braid. That's not something necessary. In fact, I wasn't going to. But because the skirt has lasted so long, I want to make sure it lasted a little bit longer. And so that is a period appropriate finish to that if you would like, or you can just leave the hem the way it was without the braid.